The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Travis McGrath, Director of Client Services here at Exago. First off, of course, thank you for joining us for today's support lab. Just to make sure everyone can hear me and see the screen okay, as usual, you are in our webinar and you can ask questions throughout. So just to make sure I'm coming through loud and clear here, if you could type a yes or a hello or a fun fact about your morning so far into the questions panel. Great, lots of greetings. Awesome to see so many people here and attentive. So today we wanted to cover a basic end user topic. We've been doing a lot of technical support labs in the last few months, and we've got some really exciting technical labs coming up. So we wanted to make sure we balance that with some nice end user topics. And specifically, we realized that we haven't done a support lab on our Crosstab report designer. So this is going to be sort of a back to basics, if you will. So let's just dive right into it. As usual, we're going to start with the lab overview. So what are we talking about today? We're going to talk about crosstab reports. We're going to give a definition to that, what they are, how they're used. Then we're going to build one, and then we're going to build something we call a pseudo crosstab. For folks who have been following these support labs for a couple of years now, one of our early admin support labs covered a very similar set of content, but we want to do this in an end user approachable way and sort of just cover it again to make sure we've got our bases, really solidified there. All right, so you might start by asking, what is a crosstab? And we're going to define a crosstab in this case as a report with dynamic columns as well as rows. So if we think of our advanced reports, our express views, all the other reports we build in Exago, the sections and the groups will build rows dynamically based on how much data we have. This report is going to do the same thing, but it's also going to build columns dynamically as well. All right, so you might say, what's the difference? The difference there is that key distinction about those dynamic columns. And to see that, I've got a report here. This is just a regular tabular report. So this is built in our advanced report designer, and it's showing our country, some category of products. In this case, we're using our sample Northwind data set, but just think of these as sort of any generic categories, and how much revenue was made in that category in that particular country. Now, you might look at this and say, okay, well, this does show me all the data, but it's pretty hard if I asked, which country had the greatest revenue or which country sold the most beverages. It's not easy to identify those things on this tabular report. So what we want to do is build a crosstab report and take this category here and break each of these into their own column. So this is the kind of report we're going to build, right? So we have a much easier to view experience where we just show the country and the category, but the categories, instead of being their own column, are now each category has its own column. So we're not lumping everything together. Now it's much easier to look through and say, oh, who sold the most beverages? We just look for the biggest number in this particular country, or which country did the total. We can add some total. So this is how we're going to think about crosstabs, is expanding dynamically the columns as well, and we want to do that to make comparing sets of data with sort of more than one axis, if you will, in a qualitative way. We're going to want to make that visually easier. Okay, so keeping this moving, we're just going to say, great, let's get to building. And what we're going to do here is I'm going to jump into my local install of Exago. I should mention I am on having a bit of a weird day on terms of my local internet and some latency, so if there's a little bit of performance here, don't worry too much about it. But what we're going to do is run this crosstab report, and here we have by country, and then we have our category. And just to get fancy, I've also broken this out by year so that we have not only sort of one dynamic column, but we have two levels of dynamic columns. And what we're going to do is show subtotals per category and grand totals. So in this case, by year, and then if I scroll all the way to the right here, we can see by country, the grand totals as well. So here we want to build out this crosstab. To do that, we can either just click on a folder and go to our crosstab designer, or click in our main menu and we'll see our crosstab report. So we're going to walk through the new report wizard. We've done this with advanced reports before, but so this will be my crosstab, my sales by country and category. And then we're going to go to our data objects, and in this case we're looking in Northwind here. So we're going to go for our orders and our customers and our order details. Keep it nice and simple. You'll notice we don't have a sorts menu here. In the regular advanced report designer we do, and we'll touch on that in just a few minutes. We can filter out data if we want, so if we wanted to limit the number of countries or the date range or something like that. But I'm just going to go right to the layout tab. And the layout tab is where we see the first big distinction between regular advanced reports and crosstabs. So the first thing we're going to notice is that instead of having one place to drag our fields, we have three. And the reason for this is because a crosstab has three components. There's something that generates rows, there's something that generates columns, and then we need some metrics to calculate where those rows and columns meet at. So in this case, our rows are going to be the country our customers come from. So I'm just grabbing customers and country and dragging that into what we call our row header source. So there's our country. Oh, you know what? I forgot about this. We're going to want our categories, of course, if we're building our crosstab to use categories. So I just pop back to my categories tab here for the data objects, grabbed the categories data object and added that to my report. So now I can get the name of my category, and this will be our column header source. And then where those two things meet, I want my revenue. So I'm just going to go to my order details, grab revenue. And in this case, I can look at it. I have an options menu here, and I can see that it's summing up my revenue. That's what I want. Look at the categories, and I can say maybe we should sort the categories as text. So here I want beverages followed by condiments, etc. And what you'll notice here is that we have sorting options, and this is why we don't have a sorts tab in the across the top of the new crosstab wizard here. And then for country, again, probably want to sort countries in text order so that I can find them easily. And then if we want grand totals, we have this options menu here on the right. We can quickly add some grand totals, and you'll notice this preview updates. And then finally, we have a theme. Of course, I'm just going to grab a theme. It's not a big deal here. In this case, let's say use country. And then we're going to hit finish. Like our normal advanced report designer, anything you do in the wizard, we can now do here. So I'm not worried if I need to go back and add something, I'll still be able to do it here. The few key things I like to do as soon as I make a crosstab is if I go to our report viewer option, so in our gear icon, if we go to options and report viewer, I like to turn on PDF. One of the things I notice here is that I know about this crosstab is that it's going to expand to the right. I don't want to try to fit it onto a page because it might have a lot of columns and I don't want them to all squish together. A couple of other notes. We've always stressed the importance of sections in the advanced report designer, and with crosstabs this is going to be true as well. So the crosstab is really an item that we're adding to an advanced report. You can add a crosstab just like you would a chart or a graphic or a gauge or a map. So here it's going to be sort of one unit even though there are multiple cells of a crosstab. And a couple of important notes. Like certain other elements, it's always going to go into specific sections. So here, crosstabs will always be in report or group footer sections. The other important thing here is to notice that the crosstab will claim all the space to the right and below it because it knows it's going to spread out dynamically with data, so it's going to want that space. If you want to add content above a crosstab, though, or to the left of it, that's totally fine. No problem there. So I'm just going to run the crosstab report, and we'll see that we have our countries, our categories across the top, and our revenue. Right? Pretty simple. So I want to pause there and see if there are any initial questions. Great. I see a lot of hellos from earlier, but no initial questions so far. So we mentioned before that we might want to break these down further. So let's do that by sales year. So to edit the crosstab, I can either just double click anywhere in the crosstab, or I can hit this modify button. And then I'm going to go to my orders, and I don't have a year here, but I do have the order date. So what I can do is apply this as a formula. So in this case, I'm just going to use a simple formula to take the date and pull only the year out of it. And then again, I'm going to go and sort this, but in this case, I'm going to sort it as a number. And instead of calling it the order date, I'm just going to call this the year. Pretty simple. But in our example output, we noticed that there were totals by category. And I don't see those here in our preview. So the last thing I'm going to do is, if you have more than one row header or column header source, you can get subtotals here by using this total option. Now that we have two here. In this case, I'm going to say category totals. Right, and you'll now see that in the preview. Great. I'm going to delete this extra column. We didn't need that anyway. And then I can simply run the report, and I have my information. So that gives us our basic crosstab. We can add additional row header and column header sources. We can add additional tabulations. We've got some extra options here. So if I need to, if I want to add additional tabulations and give them labels, or change how they aggregate, so maybe I don't want a total, but I want to count an average, or maybe I don't want to aggregate, or if instead of aggregating, I want to show this as a % of the row or % of the column, we can do that as well. So we've got a lot of cool options here in Crosstabs. And then the other thing to mention, of course, is formatting. So there are formatting options. We have these built-in themes, but if you don't like the look and feel of all those initial themes, we can change individual cells or groups of cells using all the formatting options we had available. And that includes things like conditional formatting. So if I click on a tabulation, I can build conditions based on that value as well. Great. So that's our basic crosstab. And so we can build them. They're very easy to use there. This actually just runs through what we wanted. So we want to see, the country by customer, the product category and the year of sale, and then our metric or our tabulation is our revenue. So that works, but we have one other option for something we can use. Oh, that was a great question. So I'm gonna escape the presentation for a second. Great question came back in, which was, is there an option for how many fields we can use as a column or row header or tabulation source? And the answer is yes. There's a limit here. By default, that limit is 5, but that's something that can be adjusted by your administrator as part of configuring Exago. So there is an initial limit, though it's something that can be, it's a setting in Exago that can be adjusted. So looking at this, looking at the output, there's one thing I noticed. In this data set, I have a lot of data from the mid-90s, and then I have a little more modern data. And you might ask, well, what if we wanted to add, a category that I know I want to see but isn't here necessarily in my data set, or dates, I want to guarantee that those show up. Or maybe I just have some other sort of more complex logic that I want to build in. It's not as simple as, build my columns and this. So in this case, we're going to jump over to what we call pseudo crosstabs. And a pseudo crosstab is going to use sections, so we're going to use group footers and aggregate formulas, but we're going to do this with static columns. And an example of this is we want to count the number of orders per month, but we want to guarantee that all those months are there whether or not sales are made, and maybe we have some other additional logic. In this example, we don't, but maybe we want to build in something more complex or do some sort of calculations that aren't as simple as, you know, sums or counts. So in this case, what we can do is in a group footer by country, we can build 12 columns, and we can have those columns use a formula like this. And I'll run through the formula in Exago because it'll be easier to see. So what we're going to do is we're going to edit a report we've already built that does this. And all I'm doing here is we have our sort and group footer on our customers.countries. So we're expecting one row per country. And because I know I'm breaking this down by month, I can build this out in a as columns, right? So these are static columns. And I can build out a formula here. And this formula can be simple like this one, or it can be, you know, more sophisticated if we need to build in more layered logic. But what we're doing here is we're saying we want to aggregate and we want to sum. And then we have a condition. In this case, our condition is, does the month of the order date equal 1? That is to say, is it January? And if so, we want to add 1. If not, we want to add 0. And when we put this all together, it'll give us a conditional count. So it'll say, you know, how many orders were in January. And then we can copy this formula. That great trick for copying a formula is actually just to grab the cell, hold Control, and drag it down so you can copy it to another cell. And you'll notice we've copied this formula in each of these cells, and then we've modified it, just swapping out the month of the order date, so we're checking for February, March, April, etc. This is a little more work, and I'll talk about some of the pros and cons in just a moment. But what you'll notice is in this particular case, for these countries, there were no sales in June. So I still have June to column, because instead of building it dynamically, we're building out the static set of columns, right? So this might be a reason to use a pseudo crosstab. So from a pros and cons perspective, the pros are that if there's any missing columns or everything zeros, it'll show because we've explicitly defined what we want the columns to be, and we've explicitly said to show those zeros. The other thing is we have precise control of the logic, and we can do complex conditionals. So if we wanted to build out something, you know, with more sophistication, we can do that because we're just using our formula editor. On the con side, they're static columns. So if there was, you know, updating data or there was a new category, you know, it is manually entered in this case. So we don't have those being built dynamically. And there's a lot of formulas. You know, if you don't like using formulas, it's much quicker and easier to use our crosstab designer. And then the last part is it takes a little bit longer to create, but also if you need to change something, you now have the same formula repeated a couple of times, or many times, depending on how many static columns you've defined. So changes take a little more work there. Before I go any further, I just want to pause. Does anyone have any questions on either our crosstab designer here, or on using those conditional counts, the ag, sum, if formulas, and sections to build sort of pseudo crosstabs? Great, so 2 questions came in. Yes, so the first question was, in a pseudo crosstab, is there a way to have more than one condition here, right? So you want to check the month and maybe you want to check something else about it. And the answer is absolutely. There's a formula called and. You can wrap your condition in this formula, and then you can have as many conditions, right? So this is condition 2, right? So you can have as many conditions here as you want, and you can use and, or you could use or, right? So you have a couple of options there. A second question came in about linked reports. Could you do drill downs on crosstabs? And I should mention currently, if you try to drill down on the crosstab, you'll get a message that says the toolbar item is not applicable for crosstabs. So that's not currently a feature in our crosstabs. I will mention that on our roadmap, we do have some enhancements in mind for the crosstab designer. So that, along with some other things, are under consideration and sort of early phases for our dev team. So we've got some exciting things, but that'll be later on. Awesome. So running through here, what I want to mention, that actually closes out our content, but I want to mention that we do have some exciting labs coming up. Some of these will be more technical. So on, excuse me, on May 22nd, my colleague Tom is going to be talking Exago on Linux. So he's going to walk through installing, considerations, how it works. I'm very excited for that lab. It should be great. It'll be very technical. For June, with the release of 19.1, we're going to start covering topics. We did one previous 19.1 topic. We're going to do some more coming up, of course. So to start out with, we're just going to be talking about minor enhancements, sometimes pointing out little things, making sure you know that they're there, but also that you can take advantage of them. It's nice. I believe I'll be doing that lab on the 5th. My colleague Nick is going to be doing JavaScript API filtering in 19.1 on the 19th. And then in July, we're going to be talking about time zone handling with the 19.1. So we'll talk about how it's done before our new release, and then some great additional enhancements there. So we've got 4 really exciting labs coming up. But of course, at the end of every lab, there's a survey. If you have any ideas or topics you want to see covered, please feel free to add those in the feedback as well. Great, so with that, I'll just close it out. I'll pause for any additional questions, but if you don't have any additional questions, I'll say, thanks for joining us today and happy reporting. Awesome. I don't see any additional questions coming in, so I'm just going to close it out there. And once again, thanks for joining us today.